Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine the sound of waves rising and falling in the distance. The creak of heavy wood drifts through the air, mingling with the sharp scent of salt and tar. You are standing at the edge of a long journey, one of the most painful and unforgettable passages in human history. Tonight's story will guide you through life aboard a slave ship, following the voices of those who endured the raid, the march, the dungeon, the voyage, and the arrival on distant shores. It is a difficult tale, but told slowly and gently, it carries the weight of memory and the quiet strength of survival. So settle into a comfortable place, breathe deeply, and let your mind drift with the rhythm of the sea. And if you find peace or meaning in this story, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us continue bringing these journeys of history to life. Part 1. The Raid. The morning began as it always did in the village, with the low hum of voices rising along the dusty paths. The smell of cooking fires drifted on the breeze, mingling with the sweet fragrance of palm fruit and the sharp tang of earth that had been freshly turned. Women worked at pounding grain in tall wooden mortars, their rhythmic strikes forming a steady music that carried through the air. Children darted between the huts, laughing as they chased one another, their bare feet kicking up the red dust. Men prepared their tools for work in the fields, testing the weight of hoes and baskets, speaking of the harvest to come. It was life in its ordinary beauty, woven together by habit, by family, by memory. In these villages, everyone knew each other. Grandparents told stories in the shade of trees. Mothers wrapped infants to their backs, humming while they stirred porridge. Young boys practiced with slings, aiming stones at tree trunks. Young girls learned songs that had been passed down through generations. Life was never easy, but it was familiar, rooted in the soil, held together by tradition and belonging. No one imagined that by the day's end, everything would change forever. The first signs of danger were small, almost unnoticeable. Dogs barked in the distance, sharp and urgent. A silence fell across the fields where birds had been singing. Then, faint but growing louder, came the sound of feet, many feet, rushing forward with terrible purpose. Shouts followed, not in the language of the villagers, but in harsh, unfamiliar tones. The first screams rose before anyone had time to react. Armed men poured into the village like a storm. Some carried muskets, the thunder of their shots echoing across the huts. Others bore spears, machetes, or heavy clubs. Many wore cloth unfamiliar to local eyes, bright in its colors or heavy in its weight. Some were men from rival tribes, drawn into the trade by promises of wealth. Others were strangers who had traveled the coast, working alongside Europeans who waited at the sea. They came not for land, but for people. Panic spread in an instant. Mothers grabbed children and tried to flee into the trees, but raiders had already closed the paths. Fires were set to the thatched roofs, smoke curling into the morning sky. Men ran to defend their homes with farming tools, only to be met by gunfire that tore through the air. The sound was deafening, cries of pain, the crack of musket fire, the shouts of raiders, the crackle of burning huts. Some resisted with desperate courage. A father raised a spear against an armed man, only to fall with a single shot. A boy hurled stones until he was struck down by a blow. The fight was hopeless, but in that hopelessness burned defiance. Still, most had no chance to resist. They were overwhelmed, caught, tied, and dragged away before they could understand what was happening. Those who survived the first assault were bound together with ropes and chains. The cords cut into their wrists, burning the skin. The strong were targeted first, men and women in their youth, bodies fit for labor. Children were seized, pried from the arms of their mothers. The old and weak were often left behind, some killed quickly, others ignored as worthless in the eyes of the raiders. Those who had lived in the village for generations, farmers, hunters, storytellers, now found themselves reduced to prizes, counted not as people but as goods to be sold. The weeping was unending. Mothers cried out for children who had been taken. Children screamed for parents who lay lifeless in the dirt. Smoke from burning huts stung their eyes, but it was the sight of the bodies on the ground, neighbors and kin, that seared most deeply. The captives were pushed into lines and forced to march. Whips cracked in the air, striking the slow or the hesitant. Dust rose beneath their bare feet. Behind them, the village burned, the life they had known consumed in flames. The smell of smoke, sweat, and blood clung to them as they stumbled forward. The march stretched for days. They walked in chains, yoked together, bodies bruised and swollen. Water was scarce, food scarcer still. A handful of grain was tossed to them now and then, but it was never enough. When exhaustion forced someone to fall, the guards beat them mercilessly until they rose again. Those who could not rise were left in the dirt, their cries fading as the line moved on. At night, they were forced to lie in groups, bound tightly to prevent escape. The ground was hard, the air cold, and fear kept many from sleep. Some whispered prayers, calling on ancestors to guide them. Others sang softly, songs of mourning, songs of hope, songs that clung to memory when everything else was stripped away. Strangers, once divided by distance and language, shared whispers of comfort in the darkness. Humanity, fragile and trembling, still glimmered amid despair. The march lasted weeks for some. Time became meaningless. Days blurred together into one endless road, dust rising under the merciless sun, guards shouting and striking, children crying, mothers stumbling. Some captives imagined that the earth itself was swallowing them, pulling them farther from home with every step. Others fixed their eyes on the horizon, silently promising themselves that if they lived, they would not forget the names of those lost. At last, the sea appeared. For those who had never seen it, the sight was overwhelming. The ocean stretched endlessly, its waters gleaming under the sun. Its smell of salt and brine stung their nostrils. Some captives believed they had reached the edge of the world, that beyond the horizon lay death. Others thought perhaps the sea meant freedom, that here, at last, the nightmare might end. But freedom did not wait on the shore. Rising above the waves were forts and stone dungeons, built by foreign powers for a single purpose: to hold the captured until the ships arrived. The captives were driven inside these fortresses, through heavy wooden gates that slammed shut behind them. Darkness swallowed them as they entered. The dungeons reeked of waste and despair. The air was heavy and damp, pressing down on the lungs. Hundreds of bodies were crammed together in spaces meant for far fewer. There was no room to lie down, barely room to sit. Chains were fastened to walls or ankles, forcing captives to crouch or huddle against one another. Food came only in scraps, water barely enough to wet the lips. The cries of infants mingled with the groans of the sick. Coughs echoed endlessly in the gloom. Here, time lost meaning altogether. The days were measured only by the faint light that crept through cracks, or the distant footsteps of guards. Some prayed for rescue, others for death. In the silence between screams, the captives could hear the ocean beyond the walls, waves crashing against the shore. At times they heard the creaking of wooden masts and the shouts of sailors. The ships had arrived. The captives knew it, even before they were dragged into the daylight again. The sea breeze carried new smells: pitch, tar, salt, rotting food. The sight of the ships themselves was terrifying. They loomed above the water like great beasts, their sails rising like wings. Chains rattled in the hands of the men who waited on the decks. For those imprisoned in the forts, the journey into darkness was not yet finished. It was only beginning. Part 2. The March to the Coast. The journey began the moment the smoke of the burning village faded from sight. Bound together with ropes and iron collars, the captives were herded like cattle along paths that wound through forest and plain. For many, bare feet that once knew only the soft earth of their homeland now struck against stones and thorns, bleeding with each reluctant step. The sound of chains clinking became the rhythm of their days, a constant reminder that their lives no longer belonged to them. Armed guards flanked both sides of the line, some carrying muskets, others wielding whips braided from rawhide. Their voices barked commands in unfamiliar tongues, though the language of pain needed no translation. Those who stumbled too slowly felt the lash cut across their backs. Those who resisted outright were struck with clubs, their bodies left motionless in the dust as the line continued forward. Death, quick and merciless, was the price of defiance. The march stretched across miles that seemed endless. At times the path cut through thick forest, the air heavy with the scent of damp leaves and the calls of unseen birds. At other times it wound across open plains where the sun blazed overhead, baking the captive's skin and leaving their mouths dry. Day blurred into night, night back into day, until time itself dissolved into a single, grinding movement of steps. Food was scarce. The captors offered bowls of thin gruel or handfuls of millet, never enough to satisfy the gnawing hunger. Water was rationed, a trickle from a gourd, swallowed quickly before the march resumed. Many captives felt their bellies twist with pain, yet their bodies were forced forward by blows and curses. Children wailed until exhaustion silenced them. Infants cried at their mothers' breasts, but milk often dried up from hunger and fear. Mothers rocked them as they walked, whispering songs of comfort even as their own eyes filled with tears. Fathers, uncles, and brothers who once protected their families could do nothing now but watch as wives and children stumbled beside them in chains. The weakest began to falter within days. The very old, dragged from their huts, struggled to keep pace. The sick coughed and staggered, their bodies trembling. When they collapsed, guards descended with whips, shouting until the fallen struggled to their knees. If they could not rise, they were left behind, abandoned to the forest or to scavenging animals. The column pressed on, indifferent. Each night, the captives were forced into makeshift encampments. They were tied together in groups, sometimes fastened to trees, to prevent escape. Fires burned nearby where guards ate and drank, their laughter drifting into the darkness. For the captives, the night was a time of restless silence broken by quiet sobs. Sleep came only in fragments, haunted by dreams of home and the faces of those who had been left behind. Yet even in despair, people reached for one another. Strangers whispered comfort in hushed voices. A man from one village offered words of prayer to a mother from another. A young girl clung to the hand of an older woman, who treated her as if she were her own child. Humanity, though beaten and bound, flickered stubbornly in the gloom. The march continued for weeks. Some captives saw landscapes they had never imagined, wide rivers that had to be crossed, mountains that loomed in the distance, villages where locals watched silently as the chained line passed. To those watching, it was both a warning and a promise. This could be their fate next. At times, traders met the guards along the route, bringing supplies or bartering for individuals. The captives saw themselves measured with cold eyes, valued not as people but as goods. A strong young man fetched a higher price, a woman with a child somewhat less, the elderly hardly at all. Each transaction chipped away at hope, confirming what the chains had already declared, that they were no longer considered human in the eyes of their captors. As the days dragged on, a strange numbness set in. Some captives walked in silence, their faces expressionless, their steps mechanical. Others wept until no tears remained, eyes hollow and dry. A few clung desperately to fragments of memory, the smell of cooking fires at home, the sound of drums at a festival, the warmth of family gatherings. These memories burned within them, both a source of strength and a deep wound that could not heal. Still, moments of resistance flickered. One man, desperate to end his suffering, broke free of the rope and tried to flee into the trees. He was pursued, captured, and beaten until his body was unrecognizable. His cries echoed for hours after. Another group whispered of rising together, but fear of spies and informers silenced their plans. Even in chains, trust was dangerous. The sea remained only a rumor in these early weeks. For many who had never traveled far from their villages, the idea of a boundless body of water was unimaginable. They could not yet know that their journey was carrying them towards ships waiting on the coast, ships designed to consume lives by the hundreds. For now, the road itself was its own prison, unending, merciless, stripping them of strength with each passing day. Eventually, after what felt like a lifetime, the smell of salt reached their nostrils. The air grew damp, tinged with the scent of brine. The sound of gulls echoed faintly overhead. Excitement rippled through the guards, who barked louder orders and quickened the pace. For the captives, fear deepened. They had been told whispers of the ocean. Some believed it marked the edge of the world, others that it was a place of spirits. Whatever it was not home. When at last the horizon opened and the ocean revealed itself, gasps spread through the captives. The water stretched farther than the eye could see, endless and glittering under the sun. Its vastness was terrifying. And rising from the shore were massive stone structures, fortresses built by foreign hands. Their thick walls and iron gates loomed like the mouth of a beast, waiting to swallow all who approached. The march ended here, but the journey into despair was far from finished. The captives, broken by weeks of walking, stumbled through the gates of the coastal fort. Behind them, the guards smiled with satisfaction. Ahead of them, darkness waited. Part 3. The Fortress by the Sea. The march ended not with freedom, but with stone. Rising above the shoreline, where the waves broke endlessly against the sand, stood the fortresses built by foreign hands. Their walls were thick, their gates reinforced with iron. To the weary eyes of the captives, the structures looked less like buildings and more like great beasts crouching by the ocean, waiting to consume those who entered. The guards drove the captives forward, through wooden gates that groaned as they opened. Inside, the air changed at once. The open sky vanished, replaced by shadows. The salty wind of the sea gave way to the smell of damp stone, filth, and decay. Darkness pressed close, as if the sun itself refused to shine within those walls. The captives were forced into courtyards where chains clattered and keys rattled. Men with foreign faces watched from doorways and towers, speaking in languages that the prisoners could not understand. Some wore uniforms with buttons that glinted in the light, others simple cloth stained by years of use. All of them looked upon the chained bodies as though they were objects, not people. From the courtyards, groups were separated and driven into dungeons carved deep into the fortress walls. The doors were heavy, the hinges screeching as they swung shut. Inside, the air was foul. The floor was nothing but packed earth and stone slick with moisture. There was little light, only the faintest shafts that slipped through narrow holes cut high above. The space was already crowded with captives from other raids, their faces pale in the gloom, their bodies thin from hunger. The new arrivals were pushed inside until there was no space left to move. Shoulder pressed against shoulder, hip against hip, The captives found themselves unable even to stretch their legs. The heat of so many bodies in such a confined space was suffocating. Sweat and breath mingled with the stench of waste, for there were no places for relief except the corners of the room itself. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of excrement, vomit, unwashed skin, and the sour rot of sickness. In these dungeons, time ceased to have meaning. There was no sunrise or sunset, only a dim and endless twilight. Meals came sporadically, carried by guards who dumped bowls of thin porridge or stale bread onto the floor. The captives fought for scraps, licking their hands clean, their hunger stronger than shame. Water dripped from cracks in the walls, and sometimes guards poured buckets to keep them alive, but never enough to quench the thirst that burned in their throats. Disease thrived in such conditions. Dysentery spread quickly, leaving many too weak to stand. Sores broke open on skin rubbed raw by chains. Fevers burned through the bodies of children who had no strength to resist. When someone died, their body often remained among the living for hours, until guards came to drag it away. The sight of lifeless eyes and still faces became common, another wound layered on top of countless others. For the women, another form of torment waited. They were sometimes pulled from the dungeons by guards or sailors, taken to chambers above where they suffered violation in silence. Some returned broken, unable to speak. Others never returned at all. Among the captives, shame and grief were heavy, but there was also quiet solidarity. Women whispered to one another, held each other's hands, and tried to protect the youngest when they could. It was a cruelty that stripped dignity, yet even then, the bonds of care remained. Despite the misery, voices rose at times from the gloom. Prayers were spoken, whispered in many tongues, asking the ancestors to watch over them, pleading for strength to endure. Songs, low and trembling, carried through the darkness, threads of hope that reminded each captive they were not alone. These sounds were fragile, almost lost in the heavy air, yet they became lifelines. Above them, life continued for the traders and sailors who moved in and out of the fortress. Ships arrived in the harbor, their masts like skeletal arms against the sky. The creak of wood and the shouts of men echoed down into the dungeons. The captives could not see the ships, but they could feel their presence. With every arrival, tension grew. They knew, though no one had explained, that the fortress was not the end. Something far worse waited beyond its walls. Some captives tried to imagine what lay ahead. Rumors spread quickly, carried from those who had been taken before. Some said the sea was a place of spirits, and the ships were vessels that carried souls to the land of the dead. Others believed they were to be eaten by those who held them, their bodies nothing more than meat. Fear magnified in the darkness, turning uncertainty into terror. The guards encouraged such fear. They laughed cruelly, making gestures that the captives could not fully understand but whose meaning was plain. They rattled chains, swung whips, and sometimes dragged individuals up only to beat them before returning them broken to the dungeon. It was a campaign not just of physical confinement but of psychological destruction, stripping away any sense of safety. And yet, despite everything, small acts of defiance continued. Mothers shielded their children with their own bodies. Men whispered plans of escape, even knowing that the walls were too thick and the gates too strong. Some captives refused food, choosing hunger over submission, though guards often responded with brutal force feeding, prying mouths open with sticks. Each act, however small, was a refusal to surrender completely. The waiting seemed endless. Days stretched into weeks, and still the ships came and went. More captives were brought in from the interior, their arrival marked by fresh cries and the rattling of new chains. The dungeon grew even more crowded, bodies pressed so close that sleep was nearly impossible. The air grew hotter, heavier, until breathing itself felt like a battle. Finally, the moment arrived. The sound of boots echoed louder than before. The dungeon doors swung open, flooding the space with a blinding light that seared the captives' eyes. Shouts filled the air as guards poured inside, unlocking chains, dragging people into the courtyard. The captives stumbled, blinking, many seeing the sun for the first time in weeks. The brightness was overwhelming, the sky impossibly wide after so long in darkness. Before them, beyond the walls of the fortress, waited the ships. Their hulls were massive, their sails unfurled like wings. The smell of pitch, tar, and salt water mixed with the stench of rot that wafted from their decks. The captives knew then, with sinking hearts, that the dungeon had only been a passage, a place of waiting. The true journey, the one whispered about in fear, the one that had stolen so many lives already, was about to begin. Part 4. The ship awaits. The days in the fortress had blurred into weeks, yet when the summons finally came, it felt sudden and brutal. The dungeon doors crashed open, and the prisoners were dragged into the light. After so much time in darkness, the sun struck their eyes like fire. Many covered their faces, blinking against the glare. The brightness was unbearable, but it was not the only shock. Beyond the fortress walls, looming in the harbor, stood the ships. The vessels towered above the waterline, their black hulls gleaming with tar, their masts stabbing the sky like spears. To the weary captives, they looked less like machines of wood and sail and more like living monsters, waiting to swallow them whole. The smell drifted on the breeze: salt, pitch, rotting provisions, and something darker, the heavy, sour odor of a place already filled with human misery. The guards herded the captives into the open courtyard. From above, European traders and officers watched with cold eyes, clipboards in hand, ready to record numbers and make bargains. The captives were ordered to line up, and the inspection began. One by one, bodies were examined as though they were livestock. Men were forced to stand while their arms and legs were prodded, muscles pinched to test strength. Women were made to turn, their bodies scrutinized with lingering stares that carried cruelty and intent. Children were weighed in hands like fruit at a market, judged for whether they might survive the voyage. The air rang with voices calling out measurements, notes scribbled into ledgers, prices whispered between traders. For many, the humiliation was worse than the pain. To be stripped bare under the eyes of strangers, treated as nothing more than merchandise, was a wound to the spirit as much as the body. Yet resistance was impossible. Whips cracked for those who hesitated. Clubs fell upon anyone who tried to shield themselves or their children. The lesson was made clear: in this place, humanity counted for nothing. When the inspections ended, branding began. Heated irons were brought from the fires, glowing red in the sunlight. Each mark carried the initials or symbols of the trading company that claimed ownership. Captives were held down, their screams piercing the air as the metal pressed into flesh, searing skin with the stench of burning. Some fainted from the agony, others bit their lips until blood ran down their chins. The scars would remain forever, physical proof of their stolen freedom. After branding, chains were fastened again. Iron cuffs bit into wrists and ankles, linking men in pairs, women in groups, children tied to their mothers. Guards drove them forward with blows, herding them out of the fortress gates. The road to the harbor was short, but each step felt like the crossing of a boundary between life and death. The sound of waves grew louder, the cries of gulls sharper, until the line reached the wooden docks. The ship loomed above, and the captives were forced to climb gangplanks that swayed with the motion of the tide. Many stumbled, unused to the shifting beneath their feet, and were struck until they regained balance. For some, The sight of the water below was too much. Panic surged, and a few tried to throw themselves into the sea, hoping for freedom in death. Guards caught most, dragging them back with savage blows. Those who managed to leap were pursued in boats, beaten, and hauled back aboard, their bodies broken and spirit crushed. On deck, chaos reigned. Sailors shouted in foreign tongues, hauling ropes, adjusting sails, preparing the ship for departure. The captives were driven into groups, forced to sit or kneel as the crew counted them again. Buckets of foul water were thrown over their heads, both to wash them and to shock them into silence. The cold soaked their thin clothing, clinging to their skin, leaving them shivering in the sea wind. For a brief moment, the captives could see the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly, glittering beneath the sun. To those who had never left their villages, it was an unimaginable sight, beautiful and terrible all at once. Some whispered prayers, asking the spirits of the water for mercy. Others simply stared in silence, hollow-eyed, knowing that the sea was not their deliverance but their prison. Then came the descent. Hatches were thrown open, revealing ladders that plunged into darkness below. The smell rose at once, suffocating, rancid, a mixture of rot, filth, and despair. The hold waited, a cavern of wood designed not for comfort but for confinement. Guards shouted, striking with whips and clubs to force the captives downward. One by one, they descended, the light fading above until only darkness remained. Inside the hold, space was scarce. Wooden planks formed low platforms, where bodies were meant to lie side by side, packed so tightly that movement was nearly impossible. Chains rattled as wrists and ankles were fastened to iron bolts fixed in the wood. The air was thick, heavy with the breath of hundreds crammed together. Even before the ship left the harbor, the captives struggled for air, gasping in the heat and stench. Above deck, sailors moved with brisk efficiency, securing supplies and raising sails. Below, in the gloom, the captives began to understand the reality of their fate. The fortress had been a place of waiting, but the ship was a place of no return. Some wept quietly, tears streaking their faces in the dark. Others prayed, their voices trembling but steady. A few sat silent, staring into the blackness as though already gone. The journey across the sea had not yet begun, yet already it had claimed pieces of their souls. As the tide shifted and the sails caught wind, the ship groaned and creaked. The harbor slipped away. The fortresses, the shore, the trees, all faded into the distance. Chains clinked in the darkness below as the ship turned toward the horizon. The middle passage had begun. Part 5. The Stinking Hold. The descent into the hold was like falling into another world. Above, the sky had been wide, the sun merciless but at least visible. Below, there was only darkness. The hatches slammed shut, cutting off the light, and a silence heavier than chains seemed to settle over the space. It was not complete silence. Bodies shifted, chains scraped, coughs and cries rose and fell, but the weight of the air made every sound dull, muffled, as though the sea itself pressed against the walls. The smell was the first torment. It clung to the skin, seeped into the lungs, and would not leave. The stench of human waste filled every corner. With no space for relief, captives were forced to soil themselves where they lay. The floor grew slick with filth, and the wooden planks absorbed the moisture until the walls themselves seemed to exhale the odor. Sweat added its own sourness, mixing with vomit from those sickened by the rolling of the ship. The smell of blood, from wounds opened by chains or whips, hung sharp in the air. It was a suffocating fog, unbroken, relentless. The space was impossibly cramped. Men were laid out on platforms in rows so tight that each body pressed against the next, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip. There was no room to turn, no freedom to stretch limbs. Women and children were packed separately, though their conditions differed little. The heat of so many bodies, trapped in such close quarters, turned the air into something thick, almost solid. Breathing became a labor. Every gasp of air carried the weight of another's exhalation. Darkness was nearly complete. A few cracks of light slipped through the seams in the planks above, but they only revealed the dust that hung in the air, particles of filth that settled into throats and eyes. In that dimness, faces blurred. Only the sound of chains and the occasional glint of iron gave shape to the human mass. For many, it was easier to close their eyes and pretend the darkness was total, to surrender sight rather than face the misery it revealed. The soundscape of the hold was its own torture. Chains rattled whenever a body shifted. Groans echoed, long and low, from those too weak to move. Children cried until exhaustion stole their voices. Coughs broke the rhythm, harsh and wet, carrying sickness from one body to another. The creak of the ship above, the crash of waves against the hull, and the heavy footsteps of sailors blended into a background that never ceased. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, broken, haunted. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery flowed from one captive to the next, leaving bodies dehydrated, weak, trembling. Fevers burned through the nights, sweat soaking what little cloth remained on their skin. Sores festered where chains rubbed raw. Lice crawled freely, biting until skin erupted in red welts. The dead lay among the living until guards came to drag them away, their bodies unceremoniously hauled up through the hatch and thrown into the sea. Each splash that followed marked another life erased. Food was barely enough to sustain life. Trays of boiled beans or rice were lowered, often spoiled, sometimes crawling with insects. Captives fought to scoop handfuls into their mouths, eating quickly before guards pulled the food away. Water was rationed in small cups, passed along the line, always insufficient. Thirst gnawed at their throats, leaving tongues swollen, lips cracked. Some tried to catch drops of condensation that formed on the wooden beams, licking the dampness like animals. The ship itself moved with a rhythm that many had never known. It pitched and rolled, lifted by swells and dropped again. Those unaccustomed to the sea became sick almost at once. Vomit pooled on the floor, adding another layer to the filth. The smell grew sharper, more unbearable with each passing day. Bodies slipped in the muck, and those chained together had no choice but to lie in it, their skin burning with infection. The psychological torment was as heavy as the physical. Cut off from the world, unable to see sky or land, many captives felt themselves drifting into madness. Some whispered prayers endlessly, rocking as much as the chains allowed. Others withdrew into silence, staring blankly into the dark. Mothers hummed lullabies to children, their voices trembling but determined, trying to create a fragment of comfort amid the horror. Men clenched their jaws, pressing their foreheads against the wood, willing themselves to endure. Occasionally, the hatches opened, flooding the hold with sudden light and a burst of air. The brightness blinded eyes accustomed to darkness, and the wind felt almost painful as it rushed into lungs. Guards shouted, dragging captives up to the deck in small groups, forcing them to jump and move in what they called exercise. The chains clattered as men and women were driven to shuffle in circles, beaten if they slowed. For many, the brief moments under the sky were a torment of their own, a reminder of what had been lost, what could not be regained. Then, just as suddenly, they were shoved back below, the hatches slamming shut, the darkness swallowing them again. The hold became a world of its own, where time lost meaning. Days and nights blurred together, measured only by the faint rhythm of meals and the sounds above. Some captives tried to mark time by scratching at the wood with nails or bits of stone, but the effort was futile. The voyage stretched into a timeless nightmare. Suicides began. Some captives refused to eat, letting hunger hollow them until life slipped quietly away. Others, when dragged above deck, hurled themselves into the sea, choosing the unknown depths over the certainty of the ship. Guards chained many more tightly in response, tying nets along the rails to catch those who leapt. Yet the desire for release remained, whispered in the dark, a constant presence. The stinking hold was more than a place of confinement. It was a crucible of suffering, designed not just to transport bodies but to break spirits. And yet, amid the filth and despair, fragments of resistance glimmered. Quiet songs rose in the dark, melodies from villages far away, carrying memory across the ocean. Hands reached out in the blackness, finding comfort in another's touch. Words of encouragement passed softly from one mouth to another, a thread of humanity refusing to die. The ship creaked endlessly, waves crashing against its sides. Above, sails billowed, guiding the vessel farther from the world the captives had known. Below, in the stinking hold, hundreds of men, women, and children endured, pressed together in darkness, suffocating, starving, praying. Their journey across the ocean had only just begun, and already it had become a descent into the deepest shadow of human cruelty. Part 6. The First Days at Sea. When the sails filled and the ship finally lurched away from the coast, a shudder passed through every captive chained in the darkness below. They could not see the movement of the sails, nor the coastline slipping away behind them, but they felt it. The timbers creaked as the ship leaned into the wind. The floor beneath them tilted, then rose, then sank, carrying their bodies with it. For people who had never been upon the ocean, the sensation was terrifying. At first, many thought the ship itself was alive. It groaned like a great beast, straining and flexing as the waves struck its sides. The sound of water rushing against the hull came like a roar in the darkness. The floor moved without warning, throwing captives against one another, pressing ribs against iron, slamming heads against planks. Chains rattled wildly as the bodies they bound shifted with every swell. Nausea came swiftly. The constant rolling and pitching of the vessel turned stomachs inside out. Vomit mixed with the filth already thick on the floor. The air grew fouler still, heavy with the acrid stench of sickness layered upon sweat, blood, and waste. Men and women retched until their throats burned, some collapsing into their own mess, too weak to move away. Children cried endlessly, unable to understand why the very ground beneath them refused to stay still. The first days were chaos. Many captives clawed at their chains in panic, trying to rise, trying to fight against the suffocating confinement. Guards stormed into the hold, whips cracking, clubs striking skulls and shoulders. Shouts in foreign tongues drowned out the cries. Blood ran fresh over the planks, and those who resisted most fiercely were dragged above, beaten before all, and hurled back into the dark as examples. The message was plain: the ship allowed no rebellion. Still, despair bred recklessness. Some captives, when brought to the deck for exercise, made sudden dashes toward the rails, throwing themselves over in desperate bids for freedom. The ocean swallowed them instantly, waves closing over their heads. To the crew, it was an inconvenience, a loss of profit. To the captives below, it was both horror and inspiration. Horror at the deaths, inspiration in the knowledge that escape, however brief, was possible. Guards responded by tightening restraints, lashing captives together in heavier chains, and stretching nets along the sides of the vessel. Yet suicides continued, a grim testament to the depth of their suffering. The crew enforced routines with brutal discipline. Twice a day, small groups of captives were dragged above deck, forced to shuffle in circles while chained, beaten into movement if their steps faltered. The sailors called this dancing, though it bore no joy. It was only a crude attempt to keep muscles from wasting away. Buckets of seawater were sometimes thrown over the captives, washing filth from their skin, though more often the act was performed with laughter and cruelty. The cold sting of salt water against sores brought screams, but to the crew it was entertainment. Below deck, the days merged into one another. Meals of beans or rice, sometimes mixed with spoiled meat, were lowered into the hold. Water came in cups too small to satisfy thirst. The weak often went without, as stronger hands seized the food first. Mothers tried to push portions toward their children, their own hunger gnawing silently at their insides. Disease spread with every passing hour. Dysentery, smallpox, and fevers tore through the cramped rows. Each cough became a threat, each fever another spark that might ignite an epidemic. At night, the groaning of the ship seemed louder. The waves slapped harder against the hull, and the darkness grew even heavier. Many captives whispered to one another in the stillness, clinging to fragments of language that bridged the many tribes and nations now pressed together. They told stories of ancestors, of spirits who might guard them, of a world beyond suffering. Others prayed quietly, rocking as much as chains allowed. The darkness became both torment and sanctuary, torment for what it hid, sanctuary for what it allowed the imagination to escape. Punishments were frequent. A man who refused food was tied, his mouth pried open with iron, gruel forced down his throat while guards mocked his defiance. A woman who struck a sailor during the forced exercise was flogged until her back split with welts. Children who cried too long were beaten into silence. The cruelty was systematic, designed to remind every captive that resistance would bring only suffering. Yet, even amid such cruelty, the spirit of defiance lingered. Songs rose softly in the dark, not the songs of celebration once sung at village gatherings, but low, mournful melodies that spoke of memory and hope. The rhythm of clinking chains sometimes became its own drum, accompanying the voices that dared to rise. These songs, fragile as they were, reminded the captives of who they had been before the chains, and of who they still were, even in bondage. The first days at sea revealed the truth of the journey. The fortress had been a place of waiting, the branding a mark of possession, but the ship was something else entirely. It was a world designed for dehumanization, a floating prison that carried its victims farther and farther from home. The horizon stretched endlessly in all directions. Land was gone. Escape was almost impossible. And yet, in the dark, hope flickered still, not hope for freedom in the present, but for survival, for endurance, for the chance that one day their suffering might end. For every captive who let despair drag them into silence, another clung stubbornly to life, breathing shallowly in the foul air, willing their heart to keep beating against the ship's unending motion. The voyage had only just begun, but already the first days at sea had stripped away illusions. The captives knew now that they were trapped in the belly of a beast, carried across waters they could not comprehend, bound for fates they could not yet imagine. The ocean stretched around them, vast and merciless, and the ship creaked forward into its heart. Part 7. The disease spreads. The days at sea stretched into weeks, though few captives could tell how many had passed. Without the sun to mark time, the hold was a timeless cavern where hunger and thirst counted the hours more clearly than any clock. Yet one change made itself felt unmistakably: sickness. It began quietly, with a cough in the darkness. At first, it was easy to ignore, one voice among many. But the cough grew sharper, joined by others, until the sound echoed across the planks. Soon fevers followed, bodies burning against the damp air. Skin glistened with sweat, and the smell of illness joined the stench of waste. What had already been unbearable grew worse with each passing day. The heat of the hold made the sickness thrive. With so many packed into such tight quarters, disease spread like fire through dry grass. A single cough carried to dozens of ears. A single fevered body pressed against others shared its heat, its sickness, until whole rows of captives groaned together in misery. Dysentery swept through them, leaving the floor slick with filth. Vomit mixed with blood in the muck. Lice crawled freely, biting, spreading infection. The guards cared little for the suffering. They brought food at the same rhythm, lowered water in small cups, and shouted at those too weak to rise. When bodies collapsed and did not move again, sailors came with rough hands, dragging the dead up through the hatch. Above, their corpses were cast into the sea, swallowed in seconds by the waves. To the crew, the dead were cargo lost, numbers subtracted from ledgers. To the captives, they were family, friends, reminders of how fragile life had become. Children suffered most of all. Their cries weakened into whimpers, then into silence. Mothers rocked them, whispering songs, trying to pour life into bodies that no longer had the strength to cling to it. Some infants died at their mothers' breasts, leaving women broken with grief yet chained in place, unable even to lay their children down. The darkness absorbed their cries, layering sorrow upon sorrow. The smell became its own torment. The mingling of sickness and waste thickened the air until every breath carried foulness. The wooden beams dripped with condensation, as though the ship itself sweated sickness. Skin broke out in sores where chains rubbed against flesh, wounds that festered in the filth. The captives' own bodies betrayed them, and there was no relief. The crew tried crude remedies, not out of compassion but to preserve profit. Buckets of seawater were poured into the hold, splashing over captives in an attempt to wash away filth. Sometimes herbs or vinegar were forced into mouths, choking more than curing. None of it slowed the spread. Each day more bodies grew feverish, more eyes dimmed. Death became so common that some stopped mourning, too exhausted to weep. And yet, even amid the sickness, humanity persisted. Captives cared for one another as best they could, wiping sweat from brows with scraps of cloth, cradling the weak against their own shoulders, whispering prayers to ease the suffering. In a place where survival seemed impossible, these small acts were defiance of despair. They declared that even in chains, even in filth, they were still human, still capable of compassion. Above, the sailors knew the voyage had grown dangerous. Disease did not stop at the hold. Some of the crew fell ill, coughing and sweating, collapsing on deck. Fear crept among them. The captain ordered stricter measures, more exercise above deck for the captives, more cleaning of the hold with lime and seawater, harsher punishments for disobedience. But no order could banish the truth. The ship had become a floating graveyard, carrying death across the sea. At night, the sound of the sick filled the darkness. Groans rolled through the hold like waves. Some captives sang softly, not in joy but in mourning, songs that carried memory of home and farewell to the dying. The chains clinked with every shift of a body, a rhythm that became its own funeral drum. Death was no longer a distant fear but a constant companion. And still the ship pressed on. The sails filled with wind, the waves struck against the hull, and the horizon stretched endlessly. The captives could not see it, but they felt it, the movement carrying them farther from the land they had known, deeper into an unknown future. Sickness thinned their numbers, but those who remained alive clung stubbornly to breath, to heartbeat, to the fragile thread of survival. The disease spread, and with it despair. Yet beneath despair flickered a truth the sickness could not extinguish. Each captive was more than a number, more than cargo. They were sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, carriers of memory and tradition. The ship sought to reduce them to shadows, but in every whispered prayer, every hand held in the dark, their humanity endured. Part 8. Hunger and Force. The weeks at sea carved their toll not only through disease but through hunger. The rations were always meager: a scoop of beans, a handful of rice, a crust of bread gone stale long before it reached the ocean. Sometimes fish or meat appeared, salted so heavily it burned the tongue, spoiled so badly it carried worms. The food was never enough to satisfy, and never intended to comfort. It was only enough to keep bodies alive for the voyage, no more. Hunger gnawed like an animal at the bellies of the captives. At first, they ate greedily, hands trembling as they fought to scoop the food before it was taken away. But as the days passed, as disease spread and despair deepened, some began to refuse. They turned their faces from the bowls, clenched their lips, and shook their heads. To the crew, it was stubbornness. To the captives, it was something else, a refusal to submit, a way of reclaiming the smallest fragment of control. If their bodies were no longer their own, at least their mouths could be. Mothers tried to pass portions to their children, pressing food into small hands even when their own stomachs ached with emptiness. Men divided scraps among neighbors, trying to give strength to those fading fastest. But some captives, gripped by despair, let the food fall untouched to the floor. They whispered that to eat was to accept the voyage, to prolong the suffering. Better to starve, they said, than to arrive at whatever nightmare waited beyond the sea. The crew would not allow it. Each life represented profit, and every death was a loss in the captain's ledger. Refusal to eat became rebellion, and rebellion demanded punishment. When guards saw someone push food away, they dragged the captive into the open space of the deck. There, before all, sailors forced jaws apart with iron instruments, prying mouths open until teeth cracked and gums bled. Wooden spoons or funnels were thrust between the lips, and porridge was poured in, choking, spilling down faces and necks. Some gagged and coughed, sputtering the food back out. The crew struck them until they swallowed, until the bowl was empty, until the act of resistance was broken. The scene repeated again and again. Each time it served as a warning. The captives chained in the hold listened to the muffled cries, the thuds of fists and the rattle of chains, and they knew what awaited if they too refused. Yet still some resisted. Their hunger was not for food but for freedom, freedom from chains, from despair, from a future they could not bear. The body weakened quickly without nourishment. Cheeks hollowed, eyes sank, bones pressed sharp against the skin. Those who refused to eat grew thin until their frames seemed to disappear. Some collapsed in the dark, their bodies too frail to rise again. Death claimed many quietly, slipping in with the silence of starvation. For those who survived, every breath was a struggle. The hold echoed with both hunger and despair. Bellies growled loudly in the night, groans rising from rows of bodies too weak to move. Mothers rocked children who whimpered in their sleep, their cries thin with malnutrition. Infants failed to grow, their small arms limp at their sides. Hunger did not strike quickly, but it lingered constantly, a shadow that never left. Even those who tried to eat found little strength. The food itself was poison as often as it was nourishment. Spoiled beans twisted stomachs into knots. Sour rice brought vomiting. Salted meat bloated bellies with thirst that water rations could never ease. To eat was to prolong life, but not to relieve suffering. The body consumed what little it could and wasted away anyway. On deck, the sailors joked about the captive's weakness. They tossed scraps deliberately out of reach, laughing at the desperate stretching of chained arms. They poured water slowly, taunting those whose tongues cracked with dryness. Their cruelty was casual, as if the misery of the hold was nothing more than a grim spectacle staged for their amusement. And yet, hunger became another thread of resistance. The captives learned to pass food secretly in the dimness, cupping hands to share what little they had. They whispered encouragement to those who refused to eat, honoring the act of defiance even as they feared for the life it cost. Some sang songs of endurance, low melodies that reminded each other that their spirits could not be consumed, even if their bodies wasted. In the end, the hunger and the force that answered it revealed the ship's truth. It was not only a vessel of wood and sail, but a machine of dehumanization, designed to grind down body and will alike. Yet for every mouth pried open, for every spoon forced between teeth, there remained another who clenched their jaw, another who turned away from the bowl, another who chose suffering over submission. The crew saw hunger as weakness. The captives knew it was something more, a weapon, quiet but unbroken. In refusing, they declared that though they were chained, though they were beaten, though the voyage seemed endless, their humanity remained their own. Part 9. The Violence of the Crew. The ocean gave no peace, and neither did the men who sailed upon it. For the captives, the chains, the hunger, and the disease were already unbearable. Yet another torment pressed down upon them, the violence of the crew, carried out with cruelty that seemed endless. The sailors were rough men, hardened by the sea, driven by orders and profit, but also by their own impulses. Many saw the captives not as people but as property, bodies to be controlled, disciplined, and used. To them, every whip crack, every blow, every assault was another way of proving dominance over those who had no defense. Beatings were constant. A cough during inspection, a hesitation at exercise, a stumble while climbing the deck, each could bring a lash of the whip. The leather cut open skin with ease, leaving welts that festered in the filth. Men were flogged until their backs bled, until they collapsed in silence. Women, too, were struck when they resisted or when their cries disturbed the crew. Children were not spared. The sight of a sailor raising his hand against the smallest only deepened the despair in the hold. Punishments were often staged as lessons. A man who tried to shield his wife from a blow was chained upright to the mast, flogged before all until his screams tore through the air. The crew forced the others to watch, to learn that even the instinct to protect could bring ruin. The cruelty was deliberate, calculated to break spirits as much as bodies. Yet the most haunting violence fell upon the women and girls. At night, or during moments when the ship was quiet, sailors descended into the hold with torches. They pointed, chose, and dragged women upward. Some struggled, their chains rattling as they fought to resist. Others went limp, knowing resistance would bring worse. The sailors hauled them onto the deck or into the cabins, away from the eyes of their kin. What happened there was spoken of only in whispers when the women returned. They came back with torn clothing, swollen faces, or silent eyes that refused to meet anyone's gaze. Some wept quietly in the dark, their sobs muffled by the groans of the ship. Others clutched their children, holding them tighter than before. For the youngest, the girls barely grown, the violation left scars far deeper than flesh. The sailors laughed among themselves afterward, boasting crudely, treating their assaults as entertainment. To them, it was another privilege of the voyage, as if the women existed solely for their pleasure. The captives, chained in the hold, could only endure the knowledge that their mothers, sisters, and daughters were not safe even from the hands meant to steer the vessel. The humiliation extended beyond the assaults. Women were sometimes forced to dance on deck under the eyes of the crew, their movements mocked, their bodies ogled. Men were ridiculed, stripped, and beaten for the amusement of sailors who treated their pain as a diversion from the monotony of the sea. The cruelty was not only physical but psychological, stripping away dignity, shattering the bonds of family, and leaving wounds that could never fully heal. And yet, in the midst of such violation, the captives clung to fragments of resilience. Women comforted one another after being dragged back into the hold, whispering prayers, holding hands in the darkness. Men spoke vows of vengeance, promises that one day their suffering would not be forgotten. Parents shielded children's eyes, trying to preserve innocence even when their own had been stolen. Humanity flickered, fragile but unbroken, even in the face of brutality. Some resisted even at great cost. A young woman once spat in the face of a sailor who tried to drag her away. The crew responded with fury, beating her until her body went limp, but her act of defiance lived on in whispered memory among the captives. Another man tried to rise against a guard who had struck his daughter. He was cut down swiftly, his body hurled into the sea, but his courage too became a story passed along in the darkness. These small acts, though punished savagely, declared that the captives were still more than the chains around their wrists. The violence of the crew became part of the rhythm of the voyage, as constant as the creaking of the ship and the crash of the waves. It was a reminder that the captives were surrounded not only by an ocean they could not cross, but by men who sought to strip them of every shred of humanity. The assaults, the beatings, the humiliation, all were tools of domination. Yet beneath them, the captives carried within their hearts the memory of who they had been: villagers, families, free people with names and stories. The ship groaned onward, its sails filled with wind, its hold filled with misery. The sea stretched endlessly, and the violence of the crew stretched with it, a shadow that reached into every corner of the voyage. But the captives, though beaten, though violated, though robbed of peace, still breathed. And with every breath, however shallow, they defied the crew's attempt to erase their humanity. Part 10. Whispers of Revolt. The days on the ocean dragged on, one bleeding into the next, each indistinguishable from the last. Hunger gnawed, sickness spread, and the crew's cruelty weighed like a chain on the spirit. Yet in the heavy silence of the hold, another sound began to stir. At first it was only a murmur, a faint stirring of voices too soft for the guards to notice. But slowly, steadily, it grew into something more. It was the sound of whispers, whispers of revolt. The thought of resistance had lived in the hearts of the captives from the moment the chains first closed around their wrists. It had been there during the raids, when fathers hurled themselves against muskets with wooden spears. It had been there during the march to the coast, when some tried to slip away into the forest. It had been there in the fortress, when escape seemed impossible but hope still flickered. And now, in the stinking belly of the ship, it returned again. The captives spoke carefully, their lips close to ears, their voices barely more than breath. They used gestures as much as words, small movements of eyes and hands that carried meaning across the rows. They came from many places, spoke many tongues, yet necessity taught them to communicate. Pain had become a shared language, and so too did the desire to resist. The whispers carried questions. How many guards stood above? How many weapons could be seized? Could the crew be overwhelmed in the night? Could the ship be turned back toward the land? Some believed it possible, recalling stories of others who had risen against their captors. Others shook their heads, warning that the ship was too strong, the ocean too vast, the crew too well armed. Still, the whispers persisted. For every voice of caution, another answered with fire. Better to die in struggle, they said, than to waste away in chains. Better to meet the sea in freedom than to reach the shore in bondage. The choice, though terrible, seemed clear to those who could no longer bear the waiting. The planning was cautious. Meetings could not be held in daylight, nor in any way that might draw attention. Instead, fragments of plans were passed like embers, glowing softly in the dark. One man would whisper to another, who carried the thought onward. A young woman, eyes bright with determination, memorized every detail and shared it silently with those near her. In this way, a network of quiet resolve spread through the hold. Fear was always present. The crew moved unpredictably, sometimes storming below with whips, sometimes dragging individuals away for inspection or punishment. Any wrong glance, any word overheard, could mean exposure. The sailors had informants too, captives who, under threat of death or for the promise of favor, betrayed their fellows. To speak too freely was to risk everything. And so the whispers grew softer, more guarded, until they were like threads of breath weaving through the darkness. The idea of revolt carried both hope and dread. Hope, because it offered a vision of breaking chains, of seizing freedom, of turning suffering into action. Dread, because failure promised a punishment worse than death. Everyone knew that if a rebellion were discovered, the retaliation would be swift and merciless. Those caught would be flogged, mutilated, or cast into the sea. The survivors would face harsher chains, tighter confinement, even less food. The risk was immense. Yet despair gave birth to courage. Each day brought more bodies carried lifeless through the hatches, more splashes as the dead were fed to the ocean. The captives knew they could not endure forever. If they were to die, better to die standing, or as close to standing as the chains allowed. The planning turned to timing. Some argued the attack should come at night, when the crew was weary, when the darkness could hide their movements. Others believed daylight offered the only chance, for then some captives were brought above deck, unchained, close enough to seize weapons. The debate whispered on, unresolved, but always alive. In the dark, courage was passed like water. A mother whispered to her son that he must hold hope in his heart, even if her own life failed. A man pressed his forehead against another's shoulder, swearing that if the chance came, he would fight beside him. Songs rose softly, not of mourning but of defiance, carrying strength through the suffocating air. The crew, though largely unaware, sometimes sensed the tension. They barked louder orders, tightened restraints, increased the pace of exercise. But they could not extinguish the ember that glowed in the captives' hearts. No whip could silence the whispers. No chain could bind the thought of freedom. As the ship pressed farther into the endless sea, the captives knew the time would come. Whether they succeeded or failed, whether they lived or died, the moment of decision approached. The whispers promised it. The darkness carried it. The ocean itself seemed to wait for it. Part 11. The Revolt Breaks. The whispers had lived in the dark for weeks, passed from ear to ear like sparks hidden in ash. At last, they caught fire. The captives, beaten and starved, weakened by disease but not broken in spirit, chose to rise. The decision was not made in a single moment, nor with a single voice. It grew slowly, like the steady beat of a drum too low for the crew to hear, until the rhythm could no longer be denied. The night was calm when it began. The ship rolled gently, the sails full, the moon casting a pale light across the endless waves. The crew, weary from their duties, moved more slowly, their shouts softer, their steps heavy with fatigue. Below deck, the air hung thick, as foul as ever, but within it burned a new heat, the fire of desperation ready to break free. The plan was simple, because it could not be anything else. They would strike when brought above deck for exercise, when chains were loosened, when hands had some measure of freedom. They would seize whatever lay closest, ropes, tools, even their own shackles swung as weapons. With enough force, with enough unity, they might overwhelm the sailors, take the ship, and steer it back toward land. When the hatch opened and guards shouted for captives to climb, the moment came. They ascended slowly, blinking against the sudden light, the sea air burning their lungs after so long below. The sailors barked orders, forcing them into a circle, whips at the ready. The captives shuffled as they always did, moving to the rhythm demanded. But this time, the rhythm shifted. One step was followed by another, stronger, then another. Eyes met across the line. Heads nodded. The fire leapt from one body to the next. With a sudden cry, wordless but filled with the force of years of rage, the captives surged. Chains rattled as arms swung, striking sailors with iron cuffs. Feet kicked, bodies crashed into guards, knocking them to the deck. A whip was seized, turned back against the man who had wielded it. Shouts erupted, cries of defiance mingling with screams of alarm. For a moment, the ship was chaos. Sailors stumbled, caught off guard by the sudden ferocity. A musket was wrestled from a guard, fired wildly into the night. Flames from lanterns flickered as bodies clashed, shadows lunging against one another. The ocean itself seemed to roar louder, echoing the battle that broke upon the deck. Hope flared bright. Some captives, tasting freedom in the air, believed the revolt might succeed. The sailors, outnumbered, reeled backward. The chain of command fractured in confusion. Hands once bound now fought with strength drawn from desperation, from memory of home, from the refusal to die in silence. But the crew was not unprepared. Muskets cracked, their thunder splitting the night. Bullets tore through bodies, sending captives crashing to the planks. Blades flashed in the moonlight as sailors drew cutlasses, slashing through the unarmed with brutal efficiency. Whips lashed, clubs fell, and the revolt's fire began to falter. The captain, roused by the alarm, roared orders that cut through the chaos. More sailors poured from the cabins, armed and furious. The tide turned quickly. Captives, already weakened by hunger and sickness, could not withstand the steel and gunpowder arrayed against them. The sailors fought with deadly precision, each blow driven not only by orders but by anger that their control had been challenged. One by one, the captives fell. Some leapt overboard rather than submit again, their bodies swallowed by the waves. Others fought to the last breath, swinging chains until they were cut down. Mothers shielded their children, only to be struck themselves. The deck ran slick with blood, dark under the moonlight, washed in streaks by the spray of the sea. At last, the revolt collapsed. Survivors were beaten back, thrown down, chained tighter than before. Whips cracked until their backs split, until screams gave way to silence. The dead were dragged to the rail and heaved into the ocean, their splashes marking the end of their defiance. The wounded were left to bleed, their groans ignored. Punishment followed swiftly. The crew needed to make an example. Leaders, those suspected of planning the uprising, were singled out. Some were forced to stand bound against the mast, flogged until their skin was torn to ribbons. Others were chained by the neck, left exposed to the sun without food or water. A few were executed outright, hurled into the sea while still alive, their cries swallowed by the waves. The message was clear: rebellion would bring only death. The crew reasserted its dominance with iron and fire, determined that no such uprising would happen again. Below deck, the survivors returned to the darkness. Their bodies bore new wounds, their spirits weighed heavy with grief. Yet even then, even in defeat, the revolt left a mark. It had shown that chains could not kill the desire for freedom. It had proved that courage still lived, that even in the belly of the ship, voices could rise together in defiance. For the crew, it was a victory. For the captives, it was a memory, bitter, bloody, but alive. And memory, even in chains, could not be silenced. The ship pressed on through the endless ocean, the revolt beaten down but not erased. The whispers had become cries, and though they had been answered with violence, they lingered in the dark. Somewhere in the creaking of the timbers, in the rhythm of the chains, the song of resistance still murmured, waiting, waiting. One evening the hatch opened and the smell of land crept down like a rumor. It was faint, mixed with the pitch and rot and sweat, but different. A sweetness, a green note. The captives lifted their heads. No announcement followed. The hatch closed. The dark returned. Hope did not leap. It only sat up, thin and wary, and listened. The long weeks did what time does when it is forced into a narrow space. They changed people. They thinned bodies and pared speech. They scraped away all but a few truths. Pain hurts. Kindness matters. Names are anchors. Breath is a promise. In the dark, promises are kept by staying. Somewhere ahead, land waited behind a veil of mist. Somewhere behind, villages still stood with trees casting their afternoon shade across the doorways. Between those two places, the ship continued, and the captives learned to live inside a single breath stretched beyond what anyone should bear. The weeks lengthened. The ember glowed. The ocean went on beating the hull in patient hands. And when the quiet decisions finished moving through the hold, the next chapter began to shape itself with an ache that could not be set down. Some turned inward and loosened their grip on life. Some prepared a last refusal. Some tightened their hands around another hand and chose to remain. The ship creaked. The long weeks held. The sea waited for all that was coming. Part 12. The Long Weeks. Time loosened its hold and slipped away. Days were no longer days. Nights were no longer nights. The hold had only pulses of sound and waves of heat, and the captives learned to tell the passing of hours by things that did not belong to clocks. The clatter of buckets sliding down ropes, the thud of boots on the deck above, the brief rectangle of light when a hatch opened and then vanished. In this place, memory did the counting. Hunger marked the intervals. Breath itself became a kind of calendar. The ship found its rhythm and imposed it on every body. At some point each morning, or what the sailors called morning, a hatch creaked and a braid of light fell across the planks. Bowls appeared. Water followed. Hands rose and fell. Then darkness swallowed the space again. Later, when the sun must have been higher, groups were driven up for exercise, made to circle the deck on shaking legs, pushed until hearts raced and lungs burned. After that came more heat, more stillness, and the whispers that stitched people to one another in the thick air. Nothing changed, and everything changed, the way a slow tide changes a shore grain by grain until the shape is new. Bodies adjusted in small, painful increments. Ankles learned the width allowed by the iron. Shoulders learned which angle eased the constant ache from pressing against another shoulder. Backs discovered the splinter that must be avoided and the beam that could be leaned upon. Those adjustments were lessons bought with sleep and pain. They were a kind of knowledge that no one wanted and everyone needed. In the darkness, knowledge was survival. The sounds of the ship grew familiar. The hull sighed when a swell passed under it. The ropes groaned where they met the masts. From far below there came a faint, steady scrape that none could see, as if a hand stroked the belly of the vessel. Barnacles, someone guessed, the sea's teeth making their own meal of wood. Rats scurried along beams and vanished through cracks with a confidence that made them seem like owners. Sometimes they stopped to stare, whiskers twitching, before slipping away from the reach of chained hands. Their tiny feet were another clock. Fevers still flickered, then faded, then reappeared. A cough would quiet and return the next night with a deeper rattle. Wounds crusted and broke open again at the edge of the shackles. The stink of the hold did not lessen. The nose adapted only enough to make the suffering endurable. It was never forgotten. Air moved in slow, grudging exchanges, warm as breath, heavy with waste and salt. A stranger entering would have gagged at once. The captives had learned not to gag. Between the routines of food and force and filth, a different life persisted. Hands learned to pass small kindnesses without drawing a shout from a guard. A wetted scrap of cloth placed against a fevered forehead, a swallowed mouthful of water saved and then offered to a child with cracked lips, the half of a crust pushed into someone else's palm when no one was looking. These were not grand acts. They were the size of a sip, the size of a touch. In a place that sought to erase people, the smallest kindness was a declaration. Speech found narrow paths in the dark. People traded words the way they traded water, in careful portions. Pieces of language braided together, snatches from one coast, replies from another, until meaning could cross the distance between strangers. Names were spoken and kept alive. Stories traveled along the Rao like a current. Stories of a fisherman who could read deep water by the color of the light, of a grandmother who hid a charm in her hair against evil, of a girl who could call birds to her wrist. A man told how his village planted fig trees for children on the day they were born, a root to bind a life to the soil. Another told how, before the raid, he had fashioned a drum with a skin so tight that it carried through the night like a star carries light. Faces that had been hollowed by hunger lifted during those stories and, for a moment, carried other shapes. Some people made measures of time in secret. A boy scraped a line into the plank beside his thigh each time the hatch opened for the morning ration. When he ran out of space, he began another column on the beam behind him, cutting shallow so the guard would not see. A woman tied the end of a thread around a bit of wood and knotted the thread after each forced march above deck. The wood became heavy with knots. An elder, who had once tended fields along a river that rose and fell like a breathing chest, kept time by song. He hummed the same melody after water came, another when the buckets returned, a third when footsteps overhead slowed toward evening. When he was too tired to hum, others took it up, repeating the lines until the day closed. Dreams came like visits and left the body stiff with longing. People dreamed of trees, and the dreams had smell, crushed leaf, sap on fingers, rain pulled down by bark. They dreamed of fires that warmed without smoke, of rice that steamed and filled a house, of laughing that began before a story and ended after it. They dreamed of faces, wives whose hair had been braided with shells the week before the raid, brothers who had walked at the end of the line during the march and then were gone. Waking was an injury. To open the eyes and find the hold was to fall a second time. There were days when the ocean calmed until the ship barely moved. Heat sank and pooled. The air lay on the tongue like a bitter fruit. No breeze crossed the open hatches. Buckets came more slowly. Tempers shortened above and below. The crew cursed the stalled sails and cursed the beating sun. Below deck the captives pressed their faces toward the seams where light leaked through and waited for the faint coolness that came hours later as if carried in the pockets of evening. After such days, a gust of wind felt like mercy and hurt at the same time, as a healed scar hurts when touched. There were other days when the sea rose in walls. The ship climbed and dropped, and with every drop bodies heaved against chains and each other. Buckets toppled. Rations spilled into foul water on the floor and had to be swallowed anyway. The hatches clapped down hard. Above, men shouted into the wind. Lines snapped like bone. Lightning shook the space with white flashes that found every face and then were gone. In the pauses between thunder, the hold seemed to hold its breath. When the storm moved on, The dark felt deeper for a while, the way a room feels deeper after a candle is pinched out. The crew's routines did not soften. Orders barked. Boots struck the deck. Punishments came swift to the slow, slower but just as cruel to the weak. Yet even sailors had their patterns. One whistled the same tune every time he lowered water, and though his hand was rough, the tune became something the captives listened for. Another rolled his sleeves and revealed a scar along his forearm like a pale river. He did not meet eyes. He pushed bowls forward and pulled them back without malice or kindness, a man carrying out motions that no longer belonged to him either. None of this excused anything. It only described the world as it was, a ship that turned people into parts. There were berths. The hold made no space for them, yet life arrived anyway, as it has always done, without asking. Women shielded a laboring body with their own bodies. Cloths were torn. Water was begged and stolen in ladlefuls. A cry rose, thin and fierce, and for a moment all the other cries seemed to listen. The child's life began between beams dark with old pitch. The mother's eyes closed and opened, and a friend held her wrist until the pulse steadied. That night the baby was passed to a circle of hands. The circle was not large, but it was unbroken. There were deaths, too many to recount. Some were sudden, a throat closed by fever or a heart that let go. Others were a long departing. Those took days and taught patience by sorrow. When the end came, people tried to make the space around the body different from the rest of the hold. They wiped the face. They spoke the name. They told a story to lay beside the still form. When the sailors came for the dead and dragged them upward, the stories stayed below and kept watch in the dark. There were lessons in silence. People discovered which boards complained and which could take a shift of weight without announcing it. They learned the hour when a certain guard's steps slowed, and that became the hour to pass a scrap of bread along the row. They learned how to breathe shallow when the heat thickened, and how to set the mind walking along a remembered path while the body lay stuck and sweating. A boy taught himself to count all the way to 1,000 in a tongue he had not spoken before the raid. He started again when fear chewed through the numbers. Now and then the hatch opened at an odd time of day and a shout ordered a handful of captives into the light. Sometimes it was for work at a pump. Sometimes it was to scrub the deck with salt and rags. Sometimes it was for nothing that could be named. People learned not to look at the sky too directly when they reached it. The blue was too wide. The cloud edges were too bright. The eyes filled on their own, and tears made sailors angry. Better to look at the rails, at the bruise where a wave had thrown a coil of rope against a post, at the chip in a plank that looked like a small mouth. Such details steadied the head for the return below. Songs moved in the dark like currents. Some were only humming, a shape of sound that held breath together for long minutes and then released it. Some carried words that had crossed ridges and rivers and now crossed the Atlantic in voices low enough that the crew would not hear. A line passed from one mouth to another, then returned and settled. The youngest fell asleep in the crease of those songs. The oldest kept time by tapping nails softly against wood. In a place cut away from land, song grew roots and kept people from drifting. Sometimes a thought arrived that could not be sung. It visited one person and then another. It asked the same question in different ways. How much farther could this go? How many more mornings would come? How long could a person remain a person while living as cargo? The thought left behind a quiet that was not empty. In that quiet, breaths aligned. Hands sought hands. Eyes closed because there was nothing for them to do. The long weeks taught a kind of endurance that did not feel like strength. It felt like being worn down to a core and discovering that even that core could thin and still hold. Day after day, the captives learned to keep a small flame alive where the wind could not reach it. Sometimes it was no larger than a coal. Sometimes it was the size of a seed. It lived in a prayer spoken without voice, in a memory held at the back of the tongue, in the weight of a friend leaning shoulder to shoulder in the dark. Not all heard the green note. Some heard only the sea and the scrape of barnacles and the slow drum of the ship's heart. Hunger was louder. Fever was louder. For them the long weeks were not leading anywhere. They were the whole world. And a world like that asks for answers that cannot be given. A man whose voice had been strong began to speak less. A mother stopped telling stories and rested her hand on her child's back instead. Quiet decisions moved through the hold, as steady and serious as the tide. Above, the crew talked about currents and winds. They charted distances with fingers, argued about latitude, and spat at the gulls that started to trail the stern. Below, people breathed and counted and sang and kept each other alive. The ship carried both sets of labor toward a shore none of them had seen. The voyage would end. The suffering in the hold would not end there. Part 13. Death and Suicide. Death had been present since the first night in the hold. It came with the fevers, the chains, the hunger. It moved like a shadow through the rows of bodies, silent, inevitable. At first it startled, a cough that went quiet too suddenly, a head that did not lift when the bucket came, a hand that grew cold. But as the voyage stretched on, death became familiar. It was no longer a stranger entering. It was a companion seated among them. The crew treated each death with the same cold routine. When a body lay still too long, sailors dragged it upward, iron clanking as it was unshackled. Sometimes they cursed the delay. Sometimes they laughed as if discarding a broken tool. The dead were lifted through the hatch and carried to the rail. A prayer never passed their lips. No word marked the departure. Only the splash as the body struck the sea, swallowed by waves that gave no answer. For the captives, each splash was a wound. They could not see the bodies fall, but they heard the water claim them. They imagined the ocean filling with the faces of their kin, each life sinking beyond reach. They whispered the names of the dead, refusing to let them vanish into silence. In that way, memory defied the crew's indifference. Some deaths were not taken by sickness or hunger but chosen. Among the captives grew a belief that freedom still existed, though it could not be reached on land. The ocean, vast and merciless, became both terror and promise. To leap into it was to escape the chains, to deny the crew their profit, to rejoin ancestors who waited beyond the horizon. The first who jumped did so suddenly. During the forced exercise on deck, when chains were loosened, he broke from the line and ran. His body struck the rail with a crash, and before sailors could react he hurled himself into the waves. The sea closed over him, and though nets were thrown and boats lowered, he was gone. The crew cursed the loss. The captives whispered his courage in the dark. Others followed. A woman tore free during washing, hurling herself into the ocean while her child screamed from the deck. A group of young men, chained together, leapt as one, dragging each other into the water. Their bodies flashed once in the moonlight before the sea swallowed them whole. Each act brought punishment for those who remained, but the memory of defiance lingered. Some sought death more quietly. They turned away from food, sealing their mouths no matter how the crew struck them. Their bodies weakened, their breath slowed, until life slipped away. The crew forced gruel down throats with iron funnels, but not all could be made to swallow. In the dark, companions listened to their last sighs and whispered prayers over them. Refusal itself became resistance. Children, too, faded. Hunger hollowed them, sickness drained them, and some slipped away in the arms of their mothers. Women rocked them long after breath was gone, unwilling to surrender to the finality. The crew pried the small bodies away with rough hands, indifferent to the cries of grief. The splashes that marked the children's passing were no different from any other, but to the captives they echoed louder, unbearable. The hold grew quieter as death claimed more voices. Where once there had been songs, now there were silences. Where once bodies pressed tight, now gaps appeared. Yet in those silences, strength also lived. The living carried the names of the dead. They whispered them in order, like beads on a string, keeping them close. The crew grew wary, for each suicide robbed them of profit. They chained captives more tightly, stretched nets across the rails, doubled guards during exercise. But no chain could bind the mind's choice. As long as the ocean lay beyond, it called. Some captives dreamed of it at night. They dreamed of walking into the waves as if into a river at home, of meeting ancestors whose arms opened wide, of leaving behind the filth and stench and chains. They woke to the darkness of the hold, to the creak of the ship, to the coughs and groans around them. The dream lingered, soft and tempting. Not all wished for death. Many clung stubbornly to life, no matter how hard it pressed. Mothers fought to keep their children breathing. Men pressed food into the hands of the weak. Songs rose in defiance, thin but steady. Yet even the strongest understood why others chose the sea. In whispers, they spoke of them not as cowards but as brave, brave enough to seize the only freedom left. The voyage pressed on. The sails strained, the timbers groaned, the waves rolled endlessly. The dead continued to fall into the water, claimed by the Atlantic one after another. The ship carried the living farther into the unknown, but it also carried the memory of those who had refused, those who had chosen their own ending. For the captives, death was not only loss. It was also a reminder. Each life taken, whether by sickness or by choice, declared that they had been more than cargo. They had been people who breathed, who fought, who remembered, who resisted. The ocean might have swallowed their bodies, but their defiance remained in the whispers of the living. Part 14. Land in Sight. The ocean had stretched for so long that it seemed endless. Day after day the ship pressed forward, sails pulling against the wind, timbers creaking as if the vessel itself groaned under the weight of misery it carried. Below deck, the captives lived as though the sea had no edge, as though the hold itself were the whole world. Yet one morning, or what passed for morning, the air changed. It began with a smell. At first it was faint, barely noticed above the stench of waste and sickness. But slowly, steadily, it grew, a sweetness carried on the breeze, sharp with greenery, heavy with damp earth. The captives lifted their heads, nostrils flaring. Some whispered in disbelief, others wept quietly. The ocean, which had been only salt and rot, now bore the breath of land. When the hatch opened, the change became undeniable. The air rushing in was different, warmer, laden with scents that no one had smelled in weeks. To some it recalled the forests of home, the smell of leaves after rain. To others it was strange, unfamiliar, almost menacing. Yet to all it was a reminder that the voyage across the sea had an end. The ship was nearing shore. Above deck, sailors shouted with excitement. Their voices carried into the hold, sharper, more animated than before. Orders rang out, ropes slapped against wood, sails cracked like whips in the wind. The crew moved with purpose, preparing for arrival. Buckets of seawater were poured into the hold, drenching captives in what passed for cleaning. Some were dragged up to the deck, their skin rubbed with oil to make it shine, their wounds hidden as best the crew could. This was not mercy. It was preparation for sail. For the captives, the sight of land brought no relief. When they were driven onto the deck in small groups, chains clinking, their eyes squinted against the light. And there, beyond the rolling waves, a dark line cut the horizon. Trees rose above the shore, their tops swaying in the wind. Smoke curled from unseen fires. The earth itself seemed to breathe, vast and waiting. Yet joy did not come. The land was not home. It was a place unknown, a place whispered of only in fear, the land where chains did not end, where the voyage was only the beginning of another bondage. Faces that had longed for freedom grew heavy with dread. Some prayed aloud, begging ancestors to carry their spirits back across the sea, even if their bodies could not return. Others stood silent, eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to weep where the crew might see. The ship slowed as it neared the coast. Anchors rattled, sails were furled, boats lowered to the water. The crew bustled about with renewed energy, checking ledgers, preparing irons, arranging goods for exchange. The captives felt the change in rhythm. The beat of the voyage, once endless, now quickened toward conclusion. Their bodies were weary, their spirits battered, but the thought of what awaited on land filled them with fresh fear. At night, whispers spread again in the hold. Some spoke of escape once the ship reached shore, of running into forests, of finding freedom among unfamiliar trees. Others shook their heads. They had seen too much, endured too long. They feared that land only meant deeper chains. Still, the idea of fleeing stirred hearts. The dream of running under open sky, of drinking from a river without permission, of lying on grass without shackles. It glimmered faintly, even if only as fantasy. The crew grew harsher in these final days. Whips cracked more often. Chains were tightened, locks checked and rechecked. The sailors had carried their cargo across the ocean, and now they meant to deliver it without loss. Any hint of rebellion was crushed with swift violence. The captives, already weakened, bore the blows in silence. They knew that the last stretch of the journey was the most dangerous. Still, land remained a powerful presence. Even unseen, it was felt in the way the air shifted, in the way gulls circled overhead, their cries cutting through the roar of the waves. It was felt in the way the sea grew calmer as the ship neared shore, the swells gentler, the water tinted with silt from rivers that emptied into it. The ocean, which had seemed endless, gave way to signs of an edge. For some, the sight of land rekindled memory. They thought of the villages they had left, of fields where children once played, of hearths where food had once warmed their bellies. They imagined walking into those places again, though they knew it was impossible. The horizon stirred ghosts, both of what had been lost and of what could never be regained. When the shoreline at last rose clear, the crew's shouts reached fever pitch. Land stretched before them, green and fertile, dotted with settlements of stone and wood. Smoke curled from chimneys, sails fluttered in harbors, people moved along the beaches. The captives watched in silence, their hearts heavy. The voyage was ending, but the nightmare was not. The ship anchored offshore. Boats were lowered, ready to ferry goods and people alike to land. Chains rattled as the crew prepared to bring captives above deck in larger groups. The air grew thick with fear. The hold, which had been a prison at sea, would soon give way to another prison on land. The captives knew this truth. They felt it in the way the crew smiled, in the way they licked the tips of their pens as they counted, in the way the sails were tied down neatly, as if the ship had fulfilled its purpose. They were not arriving at freedom. They were arriving at a market. The horizon, once a dream, had become a sentence. Part 15. The Auction Block. The ship's journey across the Atlantic had reached its end. The sails that had carried the vessel through storms and calms now hung still. Anchors dropped into shallow water with a thunderous splash. The land that had once been only a rumor, only a smell on the wind, stood fully before them. It was green, fertile, dotted with buildings and smoke rising from chimneys. To the crew it was profit. To the captives it was another kind of prison. The preparations began at once. Hatches groaned open, and the captives were dragged up from the hold. The sudden light seared their eyes, leaving them blinking, tears running down cheeks that had not felt the sun in weeks. The sea air, heavy with salt and earth, filled their lungs. For some, the breath was relief. For others, it was dread. They knew instinctively that this land was not home, nor was it freedom. On deck, sailors forced the captives into lines. Buckets of fresh water were poured over them, washing away the filth of the voyage. The shock of the cold made bodies shiver, but there was no tenderness in the act. Women's hair was combed roughly, oiled until it shone. Men's wounds were smeared with grease to disguise the rawness of the flesh. Children were wiped clean and made to stand tall. It was not mercy. It was display. The crew prepared them as traders prepare goods, making misery presentable. Once cleaned, they were fed slightly more than usual. Bowls of thicker gruel, pieces of bread, sometimes fruit, were pressed into trembling hands. The captives ate with caution, their stomachs unaccustomed to fullness. The food was not kindness. It was fattening, a way of making them appear healthier, stronger, more valuable for the market that awaited. When the boats were lowered, the captives were driven down the planks and crowded into them. Chains rattled with every movement, iron clanging against wood. The oars dipped, the water foamed, and the shore grew closer with each stroke. As they approached, the sound of voices reached their ears, shouts, laughter, the clamor of people gathering. The landing place was a market. Wooden platforms stood ready, high enough that bodies could be displayed. Tents and stalls lined the streets, filled with merchants, buyers, and overseers. The smell of roasting food mixed with the sharper smell of livestock and the faint sweetness of sugarcane. People pressed together to see the new arrivals, eyes bright with curiosity and greed. The captives were herded from the boats and marched into the market square. Crowds stared, pointing, whispering. Some laughed openly. Others prodded with canes or hands, testing muscles as if testing the ripeness of fruit. Mothers tried to shield their children from the gaze, but chains made shielding impossible. Men tried to stand tall, but weakness betrayed them. Every gesture was watched, every detail noted. The inspections began. One by one, captives were forced onto the platform. They were made to turn, to show their backs, their arms, their legs. Buyers pressed fingers into their skin, testing for strength. Mouths were forced open, teeth examined as though livestock. Women were touched with crude familiarity, their bodies appraised with no regard for dignity. Children were lifted, weighed in hands, their future measured in years of labor to come. The auctioneer shouted numbers. Voices rose in reply, offers called from the crowd. Hands lifted, deals struck, names written into ledgers. Each captive became a price, reduced to a sum of money. Families were split in moments. A mother was dragged one way, her child another. A man reached for his wife, only to have the chain jerk him back. The cries of parting filled the square, but no one listened. Those who were sold were led away quickly, bound for plantations, workshops, or households. They were marched in new chains, their futures sealed by the stroke of a pen. Those who remained waited in terror, knowing their turn was coming. The platform became a place of endings. Each name shouted by the auctioneer marked another break, another wound, another life stolen. The captives understood now that the voyage across the sea had been only the beginning. The middle passage ended at the auction block, but the road ahead stretched into years of forced labor, of pain, of stolen generations. The ocean had carried them far from home. The market declared that there would be no return. And yet, even here, in the square filled with laughter and trade, something endured. Whispers of names carried through the crowd, spoken softly so they would not be forgotten. Hands brushed briefly against hands before chains pulled them apart. Eyes met in silent vows, to remember, to survive, to pass on stories of what had been lost and what still lived in memory. The auction block was meant to strip humanity, but humanity clung stubbornly to every captive. They were not cargo, not numbers, not marks on a ledger. They were people with histories, families, songs, and spirits that no price could erase. As the sun sank that day, and the market square slowly emptied, the ocean behind them swallowed the horizon. The ship that had carried them across it stood silent at anchor, its hold emptied of the living, its timbers still heavy with ghosts. On shore, new chains tightened, new orders rang out, new lives of bondage began. The middle passage had ended. The struggle for survival continued. The voyage has ended, though the echoes of it linger. The chains, the cries, and the silence of the sea remind us that history is not only about events, but about lives, lives that carried courage even in the darkest places. As you drift toward rest, let the rhythm of the ocean fade into quiet. Carry with you the strength of memory, and the knowledge that stories like these must never be forgotten. If you found this journey meaningful, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your reflections in the comments. Every voice helps us keep history alive, and your support ensures that these stories continue to be told. Sleep well, and may peace find you tonight.